Hi, everyone. Welcome to chapters 12 and 13. I combined these two because we're talking about the period before the Civil War, kind of like where where the mindset is of the American people just prior to the Civil War. And economy and religion play a large role in those, and that's what chapters 12 and 13 are talking about. So I smushed them together for one unit study. So at the end of this unit study of chapters 12 and 13, you'll be able to understand the economy situation uh, between the North and the South. You'll know more about King Cotton and also the Second Great Awakening and the role that religions and other theories came to play into the making of the mindset of the American people before the Civil War. So, antebellum means years before the war. So, when we talk about the antebellum South, we're talking about the South years before leading up to the Civil War. The South during the antebellum period grew tobacco and rice, but cotton became king. It was the top product that the South produced. With tobacco and rice, obviously those could be used and sold. Cotton, however, was a cash crop that was sold for profit instead of the farmer's use. And let me tell you why that is. Now, my grandparents obviously were not alive during this time, but they were born like in 1920, so they were very much part of the Great Depression era, and they were farmers, subsistent farmers. Subsistent farmers mean you make enough to take care of yourself and your family. So, my grandfather was a subsistence farmer, and he decided one year that instead of buying cotton for quilts, cotton batting, that's kind of you roll it out and you put it in between layers of fabric to add the fluff that adds to the quilt. So my grandmother obviously quilted because the family needed things to stay warm in the winter. So he decided that it would be a great idea to grow cotton so he wouldn't have to buy cotton. I still have one of those quilts made from that cotton, and it is horrible. It's lumpy. From time to time, you can feel a seed poking you in it. I mean, it's just horrible. So after that, my grandmother threw a fit and said, Homer, you're not going to do this anymore. So they always bought cotton batting after that. So that's one reason that cotton was not used for farmers' use. It profited them more to sell it to have it processed. And it was processed starting with something invented by Eli Whitney called the cotton gin. Now, the cotton gin, it didn't like stab it and create it into batting or anything like that. It didn't do all of that. But it did remove the seeds. And as it removed the seeds, it kind of pulled the fibers apart, and which also added to processing. So when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, he thought it might actually end the need for slave labor. However, because I mean that's what slaves did, they picked the seeds out of this cotton. And if you've ever touched a cotton boll, the ends can be prickly, the seeds are pointy, so it's not fun. So he thought that it might actually diminish the need for slavery. What he didn't count on, though, was how much the processing sped up the whole removal of seeds. So instead of actually decreasing slavery, the cotton gin increased the need for slavery because they needed to produce more cotton and they needed more labor to pick the cotton. So there we have it. So the cotton gin that Eli Whitney invented in 1793 did not end slave labor. Also, just kind of interesting here, just to throw it out, Eli Whitney didn't really make any money off the cotton gin. So he did make some money later on by contracting with the government for some elements of gun production. Anyway, so just wanted to mention that to you. His cotton gin produced 50 pounds a day. By hand, it was 1 pound a day. It's a huge difference. So you can see how it would increase the need for labor for picking cotton. So I've mentioned before Thomas Jefferson's idea of farming. Thomas Jefferson's idea of America would be that people were subsistence farmers, like my grandfather was, that everyone would produce enough for themselves, that they would be happy, that they might produce a little extra to sell to other people in times of need, that sort of thing. But to Thomas Jefferson, all these farmers were white, small farmers. They weren't, plantation owners. They were subsistence farmers, like I mentioned, on individual plots of land. But the reality was very, very different from that. A mass clear cutting took place. Lots of trees were cut to make room for all of these cotton plantations because, like I said, when Eli Whitney's cotton gin took off, all of a sudden everyone wanted to produce more cotton. Slavery grew. Land was wasted, and it was often cast aside instead of reworking the soil because the idea was that land was limitless. Think about where we are at this point in history. So we're in the 1800s, and we've had people moving west because, that's the American right to move west. That land is just there for the taking, according to the manifest destiny theory. So that's kind of how people treated land. They were not the good stewards of land that Thomas Jefferson kind of foresaw. Cotton was planted in March and April, and it required constant weeding. It's not like you planted it, you forgot about it, and then you went to harvest it. Constant weeding. So think of that back-breaking labor of it being bent over, pulling weeds by hand out of the cotton. The cotton bloomed in August, and it was picked by hand from sunup to sundown because it took that long to pick that much cotton. One of my favorite things is as my husband works in Pine Bluff, he still sees that cotton in the early fall, usually August, September, and the cotton fields are blooming there and everything. Of course, now picking is done by machinery. So, in order to transport this cotton, the plantation owners used steamships for transportation. There were just a few major ports for the South. That was St. Louis, Missouri, Memphis, Tennessee, and New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1817, there were only 17 steamships in Western rivers. But by 1837, just 20 years later, there were more than 700 steamships in operation. That shows just how much cotton was being produced and transported. So let's talk about the domestic slave trade, because in 1807, Congress abolished foreign slave trade. That new law went into effect on January 1st, 1808. So African slaves could no longer be transported into the United States. Of course, there was smuggling. Smuggling continued, but the biggest market at this time then became domestic slavery. So white owners sold slaves, can't talk, sorry. White owners sold slaves, doing it again. White owners sold slaves for big profits. And so this becomes, the slave brokering becomes a huge business. And as children were born of slaves, of course, slaves are seen as property. So any child that they had born into slavery was also deemed property and also up for grabs as far as sales go. And that happened a lot. Children were sold out from under families. Partners were sold away from each other, that sort of thing. White owners had pens and warehouses where slaves were held. So let's say if you've got slaves that you are shipping to another slave state and or transporting, probably by train at this point, then there were areas established so that those slaves could be held in a place until they could be transported, a lot like we see developing with cattle at the same time. So slaves are treated as livestock. Between 1790 and 1859, Virginia slaveholders sold more than 1/2 million slaves. That's just from Virginia. So the domestic slave trade was very large. In 1800, according to the census, there were more than 1 million African Americans. 900,000 of those were slaves. And as I mentioned, slaves were sold away from family and friends because they were just seen as straight up property. Slaves are very definitely working this cotton industry. Cotton is king. Slavery is what fuels that industry. So some Southerners thought that their cotton crop gave them independence from the North's growing industrialization. But ironically, cotton was really very much needed for North industrialization. Remember the textile mills like Lowell had, that and all of the others, they needed that cotton. And so they were really very much dependent on each other. 75% of the US cotton was exported abroad. And at this particular time, the United States was the world leader in cotton production. In 1820 to 1860, 80% of the world's cotton came from the US, and most of that was shipped to Great Britain. The South's cotton focus meant dependence on other areas. So, because they were focusing so much on cotton, they had to get things from other places. Their corn and pork came from the West. Inexpensive clothing came from the North. And why is that? Because the North had the textile mills that they were providing the cotton for. Home furnishings also often came from the North. And carpets, lamps, dinnerware, upholstered goods, books, and instruments either were imported from foreign countries or came from the North also. I want to point out a couple of differences to you. The kind of slavery that we're talking about here is referred to as chattel slavery. That's when you hold someone as property. In this case, the holding of Africans or African Americans as property. This is very, very different from indentured servitude. Indentured servants worked off a fine or a bill. And a lot of times they could go home after a day of work and then they'd report back to work the next day. They were working for free till they paid off a debt. Chattel slavery was flat out property owning. The chattel slave was bound to its master forever. No questions asked, forever. So let's talk a little about the hardships of slavery. You already know about these, so we'll just kind of skim over them, not because they're not important, but because you do already know about them, and we've got a lot to cover here. But this was at all levels of severity. Living conditions were poor. They rarely had enough food. Diseases like cholera and hepatitis were spread amongst these people who shared tight living quarters and honestly didn't get any health care from their owners. So they had backbreaking labor, often physical abuse. The families were often separated by sales, like I mentioned, because, at this point, these people are treated as livestock. They're sold and traded like property. And sexual harassment and rape of slave women. So let's talk a little about slave life. It was based on the idea of paternalism. And paternalism is this concept that white owners would act in the best interest of these slaves, that they needed kind of a father to take care of them because they were not smart enough to take care of themselves. Paternalism meant that this master took responsibility for their care, their feeding, their discipline, their Christian morality, which was used to try to justify slavery because it was considered taming savages. Like these slave owners were doing their slaves a favor by owning them. So, because of this stereotype, because think about it, it's kind of ironic. The idea that white slave owners had to take care of the slaves, who was really taking care of whom at this point, right? The slaves are doing all the hard work. They are taking care of themselves as best they're allowed to. They're taking care of whole families, of whole plantations with their labor. So the whole idea of paternalism basically was this concept that really kind of reinstituted and justified the idea of slavery. So the slaves occasionally tried using these stereotypes to their advantage. So it was a way for them to resist the poor treatment that they were getting. So if they were going to be treated like children, sometimes they might break a tool or work too slow. Of course, that could be problematic if severe discipline was involved. Some ratted each other out for preferential treatment. This one's doing this on purpose because, he doesn't want to work. And so then that person might be given some like managerial, like you're going to manage this group of slaves and you guys are going to get this work done. Some discipline included the threat of selling them away from family and friends. Whippings were common, which sometimes left them unable to work, which is totally against the idea of what it was all about anyway, right? About the labor. Sometimes it even killed them. Um, some whippings were by the overseer, but not the master himself. Masters encouraged the reproduction of slaves for the reason that what I've already talked about, because, they're breeding these people for profit, just like livestock. In terms of slave life, many slaves embraced Christianity because it gave them hope. And because it was accepted by the white people, the masters thought that it taught obedience. So they allowed church. Remember, years prior, there was a fear of slaves congregating because they might rebel. So now they're saying, Christianity being what it is, let's allow slaves to have Christianity also and have their own church. So they were allowed to worship. There were also free blacks in the South, a little over 260,000 in the slave states and 226 in the North. 226,000, I should say, in the North. Most of the free blacks lived in Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina because of a system called manumission. That's why they were free. Manumission. Manumission is the formal granting of freedom to slaves, and any slave owner could do that. The Revolutionary War, spurred the beginning of manumission because, people started talking about equality. All men are created equal. So they start thinking about it, and some people did free their slaves. Most lived in cities. Most of these freed slaves lived in cities. Lighter skinned women were evidence of interracial unions. And blackness, the degree of the intensity of the color of the skin, was associated with slavery. And so the darker the skin, the lower the person was associated at the bottom of the social ladder. So a lighter color skin was higher on this kind of social ladder because it showed what? It showed integration of white blood too. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting that social status was based on the darkness of the color of a black person's skin. Some South free blacks owned slaves, and some amassed large fortunes, but it was rare. I mean, that can't be seen as the example because it happened so rarely. Nat Turner's rebellion happened in Virginia in 1831. Turner and his group, Turner was a slave, Turner and his group killed 60 white people, including many women and children, before being captured. Turner and his 16 followers were executed, and rumors spread that this uprising was leading to a national problem. So this brought about mass panic among white populations, and they used militias to attack and kill black people based on this fear. So here is the white class structure in the South. I want to point out to you that the majority of white people in the South did not even own slaves. Okay, so just over 76% of white people in the South in 1860 did not own slaves. Now you can see here 17% had 1 to 9 slaves, 6% had 10 to 99 slaves, And 0.1%, very small sliver of white people who were slaveholders with more than 100 slaves. So in the 1830s, slaveholders worried about losing slavery and what they considered the honor of white Southerners. So think about that social ladder again, that social hierarchy that we just talked about, where the darkest people were at the bottom of that ladder. And as you work your way up, the pigmentation of a black person's skin tone would give them a higher rank if it was lighter. So who's at the top of the social ladder, obviously, at this time? White people, right? So the idea of defending white honor meant keeping people below them. As horrible as it sounds today, but that's how it was. That's what we're talking about as far as the mindset of these people in the antebellum South. The Tariff of 1828 looked to John C. Calhoun as proof that the North wanted to destroy the South's economy and culture. The tariff would hurt the South but benefit the North. So this is when nullification of federal laws really began to take place in North Carolina, and we talked about that in the last chapter. Harvard professor Louis Agassiz defended slavery and said that different human races came from different origins, that black people were a whole different form of race. That is called polygenism, and we'll define it in just a minute. But if someone from Harvard said it, people are taking note of that. They're saying, oh, okay, well, white people and black people are different because we're not the same. We're not created the same way. That was the thought in the 1860s that's being propelled by this Harvard professor and others. So polygenism is the concept that different human races have different origins. And I've got this image here to show you. We have a Greek here with this kind of cranial example. We have an African or African American here with a different shaped cranium. And then we have this chimp here. And so Josiah Clark Knott and George Glidden implied that black people were a totally separate creation, ranked somewhere between Greeks and chimpanzees. That was the common thought in 1857. Polygenism was sometimes featured in creation stories. Like the Bambuti Pygmies believed that their supreme god created 3 different kinds of people from clay, from white clay, from black clay, and from red clay. So because of that creation story, it kind of made sense to them that there would be 3 different kinds of people created, different kinds of people, okay, different kinds, people who had different origins. Traditionally, most Jews, Christians, and Muslims believed in monogenism, which is the idea that ultimately all humans descended from a single mating pair. In Christianity, who is that? If you said Adam and Eve, you are correct. So science seems to contradict this idea of a single first man and a single first woman. But one scientific explanation that kind of seeks to clarify it and to confirm Christianity and this monogenism idea says that the population directly ancestral to all modern humans remained united as a single population by constant gene flow. And because of that constant gene flow, then, and because everyone came from that same constant gene flow, then they will call that monogenism. So polygenism was the most popular concept of thought in terms of this in the 19th century. Even considering Christianity, people were talking about this so much. The idea behind polygenism, too, is that they were using distinguishing words like civilized and barbaric, civilized representing white people and barbaric representing black people, which justified to them the institution of slavery because The white people were civilized, the black people were barbaric. In some kind of stretch of the imagination, they felt like they were justified in keeping these people as property, that it was okay to do because these people were barbaric. And by keeping them as property, they were kind of taming them. Okay, let's move on to elements of chapter 13 here. We're talking about the Second Great Awakening here. So, the Second Great Awakening was an evangelical religious movement of the early 19th century. So, we're talking about the early 1800s that focused on outdoor revivals and social reform dedicated to equality and free will. Now, the Second Great Awakening is going on at the same time as these people are thinking about polygenism and trying to hang on to slavery. So keep that in mind. Free will is the power of humans to act independently of social, natural, and religious constraints. People who were slaves obviously had no free will. As reformers began pushing the idea of free will, all of this becomes more obvious to some people. Not to all people, but to some people. So, we've talked in the past about Calvinists and about how Calvinists believed that God predestined some people to be saved and some people to be damned. But the evangelicals taught something totally different. They taught that people could decide to turn away from their sin, that their destiny was actually controlled by them, and they had free will to choose God or to deny God. And they promoted the reading of the Bible. So the idea was that anyone who can read can understand its messages and develop a relationship with God. The overarching idea here is that religion, evangelicalism, was for everyone, not just the chosen, whether they were chosen because of predestination or chosen because they were elite or chosen because they were rich or chosen because they were white. The evangelical movement uh, often featured this camp meeting style with large outdoor tents, kind of a tent revival. If you know Arkadelphia well at all, you know that some churches still have these today. Like Arkadelphia people may have heard of Davidson Campground, and every year, every summer, they get together at this campground. People bring campers, they bring tents, there are cabins out there, and it's old-fashioned camp meeting along the lines of this evangelical movement. And it promoted the growth of more Protestant religions and really kickstarted Black religion too. Evangelicalism benefited slaves because of the idea that Christianity gave hope to the African American slaves. Also, the idea that conversion, if you convert to Christianity, that then you can be saved. It really encouraged people through their hardships. It encouraged these enslaved people through their hardships. Evangelicalism was for everyone, and that meant them too, the enslaved, that they could have religious encouragement and a relationship with God. So, if God is for everyone, we start to see this huge concept of equality, just the roots of it really kind of starting to take place. There were some concerns about the evangelical movement. At first, slave owners worried that the churches would make these slaves feel like they deserved equality. But the Southerners kind of came to peace with the idea that a Christian slave would be more dedicated to hard work and more obedient. So that's why they were on board. The evangelical movement emphasized the need for morality in a sinful world. Slave owners had worried that that would change slavery somehow. You know, that um, this idea of, think about it. These people are getting beaten, periodically. This idea of morality might impact the way that they were able to discipline. It might also impact their child reproduction, which is something that the slave owners were profiting from. The idea, too, that concerned people, that concerned white people about the evangelical movement was the idea that those who were good went to heaven and those who were bad went to hell. So, would they be in heaven with the very people they were enslaving? something that really bothered people. The movement to encourage the masses to be better and to be good and to strive for heaven led to social activism, and people who were really pushing the idea of equality really made a difference for those who were enslaved. We also see the development of more charities. These first charities were really small organizations that were primarily dedicated to converting more Christians along the lines of the evangelical movement. There were also some social ills charities, people who look around and say, these things are bad. Let's start an organization to fix it. So, keep in mind here, not everyone sees the same thing as a problem. So that becomes an issue. Some of these were very highly rated topics at the time, like temperance groups. Temperance groups focused on eliminated the drinking of alcohol. So they were against liquor. They didn't think it was a good idea to drink alcohol. The Magdalene societies focused on the issue of prostitution, and abolition grew out of this movement too, from the evangelicals who were trying to reconcile equality and morality and slavery, and they just couldn't work it out. They didn't see how slavery could work with equality and morality. So they started working to abolish slavery, and this really divided Northerners and Southerners, largely because the Southern economy depended on slavery so much. The Underground Railroad, we won't go into a lot of detail on here, but it was a secret system of safe houses that led slaves to freedom. I know when I was a little kid and people talked about the Underground Railroad, I kind of envisioned this like Subway, but only with a train, right? Anyway, nothing like that. Just a series of safe houses where people could hide and be led to the north to freedom. The developing of African American culture. Slave owners forced slaves to abandon their native cultures from the very beginning. So, other than resistance, one way that slaves dealt with the situation was to turn to family and their culture with elements that they did keep and the new culture that they were developing. So, remember, not all slaves came from the same place. So, as slaves would become acquainted with each other on these plantations or these large farms, wherever it was that they were held, then they would start to adapt to develop their own culture, but they keep little elements of what they could as far as traditions and that sort of thing. And so now people, the enslaved, are able to include Christianity into the mix with some of their native African traditions as well. Storytelling and music was important to preserving the slave culture because most did not read or write, so all the traditions were oral. And that's why it's very difficult these days if you do genealogy, if you're an African American or you have African American heritage, it's hard to find some African American records because records just were not kept for slaves because they're treated as property more than anything. Um, so all history and traditions were really oral. They were told by stories passed down from generation to generation. The Brer Rabbit story, if you've ever heard that, was this simple rabbit who continually outsmarted bigger, stronger animals, which was encouraging to the slaves because they were seen as these simple humans who were treated like animals, and it was encouraging to them to see the simple rabbit who continually outsmarted the bigger, stronger, and in this case, the bigger, stronger master or overseer. And religious spirituals also encouraged slaves. They kind of framed hardships and passed coded messages about potential escape opportunities that went undetected by their masters. So in a way, they were a lot like Brer Rabbit sometimes in outsmarting the masters through these secret songs and the Underground Railroad. On your test, there will probably be a question that says, according to Mrs. Pennington, what was the Civil War fought about? And the answer to that question is slavery. I say according to Mrs. Pennington because I know many people disagree with that. But here's why I say that the Civil War was definitely fought about slavery. First of all, you'll hear, no, it wasn't. It was it was states' rights. It was about state sovereignty and the ability for the states not to be impeded by a federal government. But it was the states' right to keep slavery, right? The states' right to keep slavery. So the economy argument, well, no, this was about the economic difference between the North and the South, and the North was trying to stick it to us, Miss Pennington. That's what they were doing. They were sticking it to us with these tariffs and all of that, and then they had all of the industry up there. Well, they had the industry up there, but we had the cotton down here. So that economy argument is invalid. It was about keeping free labor that the slave states had because it depended on the South depended on slavery for production of this cotton. Cotton was king. In the Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, approximately 700,000 people died. The Union, so you hear the Union and the Confederates, or the Union and the rebels. The Union was the Federal or the North, and the Confederates or the rebels were the South. It's important to remember that not all slave states, that's bad, not all slave states seceded from the Union. Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland did not secede from the Union. They were slave states that remained part of the Union. So Arkansas, and this is not in your notes, but just kind of an interesting aside, Arkansas actually called the state legislature together to make a decision on what to do. Would they join the Confederacy or would they join the Union? And so Arkansas decided not to join the Confederacy initially. They didn't want to secede. They wanted to kind of stay out of it, you know. Not our fight, they said. And we don't want to deal with this. But then Lincoln called for all states within the Union, and Arkansas at that time was still in the Union, for all states in the Union to send soldiers to fight to preserve the Union. And at that point, the legislature was called back to session, and the Arkansans decided, look, if we're going to fight anyway, let's pick a side. And that's when they chose to go with the Confederate side. So the Union had more soldiers, 22 million soldiers versus 9 million soldiers. And 3.5 million of those were slaves, and probably not very much fighting for the South. They were probably pretty much looking to escape to the North. So anyway, 3.5 million of those 9 million were not very supportive of the South. The North manufactured more goods than the South. That was a huge advantage for the North because, you know, we relied on so many other places for things like pork, like we talked about, corn, all of these other things that we didn't grow because we were making a ton of money through cotton. The North manufactured more goods than the South. The North already had 20,000 miles of railroad track laid. The South only had 10, and the laying of railroad tracks stopped when the Civil War began because it wasn't safe to do that in the middle of a war. So the North had more opportunity for transportation. The South's only advantage was that it had better military leaders. So that wraps up chapters 12 and 13. If you have any questions, drop me an email as always.